let's go through the process of deploying UniLink, showing how you can migrate existing data from a legacy Kafka cluster into a StreamNative BYOC Ursa cluster. We would then be able to see that data registered in Snowflake Open Catalog and query it inside of Snowflake AI Data Cloud. Then you could go through the process of moving over your consumers and then your producers to completely move the application over. So here I'm producing on the left and consuming on the right messages to an existing Kafka cluster. And we're going to be migrating this data and potentially the applications as well into a StreamNative BYOC Ursa cluster. Here I am in StreamNative Cloud, and I've already created that instance and cluster here in the UI. Let me go ahead and click on it. If I go down to configuration, you can see that the backend is configured to use Snowflake Open Catalog. So it'll save the data in Iceberg format, and then it'll be registered automatically in a warehouse called StreamNative 6. You could then query that data inside of Snowflake AI Data Cloud. Going back to the org level, let's deploy UniLink to start copying the schema, the data, and the consumer group offsets from that source cluster into this cluster. If I go over to UniLink here on the right, I'll go to Create and say Schema Migration. I'm going to call that My Schema Migration, and I'll click on Source and Destination Details. Here for the source cluster, this is going to be the endpoint for the schema registry. And then for instance and cluster, I'm going to select the instance and the cluster of my StreamNative BYOC cluster that I want to move the data into here. So I'll say my instance, my cluster. And then under secrets, you can create a new secret, or if you already have them in one, I'm going to create here, or select the My Schema Migration secret. This is your API key to get into that schema registry. Under subjects configuration, I want to replicate all of the schemas. And then you can add a prefix that's related to the tenant namespace, or use a string with an underscore to prevent conflicts if you're moving multiple clusters into this one, but I'm going to leave everything as the defaults for this example. It'll then show you a preview of the subjects that are going to get copied over. I'm currently working in Kafka topic 2 that I was showing you in IntelliJ, and that's also the name of the source subject here. But I also had been doing some work in another topic called Kafka topic 1, but we're going to be focusing on 2. So let me go ahead and deploy that. After just a few seconds, it should say that it's active if you refresh the page or hit the refresh button here. And then next I want to go through the data migration process, which will also migrate over your consumer group offsets and periodically update them so that when you turn off your consumer, you can move the application over as well. I'm going to go ahead and say create data migration, and I'll call that my data migration. And under source and destination details, this is the endpoint where you would produce and consume messages on that source cluster. So this is different than the schema registry. And then the destination again is my instance, my cluster. And then the secret here is the API key to get into that cluster. And I already have that in here. And I'm going to say topics mapping. After checking the connection, here you can choose which topics to replicate. I'm going to say all topics, and then you can again add a destination prefix if you want to avoid conflicts, if you're going to be moving multiple clusters, and then how often it does a check for updated topics. So this is the refresh list of the topics or topic configurations. You can also exclude topics, but I'm going to say preview topics. You'll see that there's 2 topics that it wants to copy all of the data over for. Clicking continue, I want to enable consumer group replication so that the offsets would be periodically moved over. And then because of that, need to make sure that I also have the schemas. So for the consumer groups, I'm going to say all consumer groups, and I'm going to turn the sync interval down a little bit. I'm going to turn it to 15 seconds. So once I turn off my consumer on my legacy cluster, that consumer group will be sure to be replicated over here more quickly. And I'll go ahead and click deploy. We can see here that there's multiple consumer groups that it's going to be migrating, and I'll click deploy on that. And if you wait just a little bit, it'll show as active as well. Going back to the organization, if I click into my instance and then go to public and default and look at my topics list, you should see the 2 topics get automatically created. And then if I go back into UniLink, into my data migration, go to topics progress, you should see that there's some data being copied over as well. As I mentioned, the cluster is set up to use Snowflake Open Catalog as the backend. So if I go over to Snowflake Open Catalog, I was using a catalog called StreamNative 6, and it's created automatically a public default series of folders or schemas. And then the topic here, Kafka schema topic 2, has some data in it. So it's starting to show up here, and you can see that the schema is automatically registered. So at this point, you would then be able to go over to Snowflake AI Data Cloud. You'd be able to set up an integration with Open Catalog, and you'd be able to query all of this data just like you would any other data inside of Snowflake. Now that all of the data is being copied over to the StreamNative cluster, all the historical data and the live updating data, I want to go through the process of moving over my consumer and my producer. Here I'm going to just terminate the consumer, and it looks like we got to message 594. Now I terminated it instead of going through a graceful shutdown, so I'm not sure if all of the last acknowledgments made it back into my legacy cluster, but what we should see is when we start up a consumer that points to our StreamNative BYOC Ursa cluster, the consumer there should start up at a very similar location, maybe off by 1 just because we didn't go through a graceful shutdown. I believe I also left at the frequency at which the offset of our consumer group gets copied from the legacy cluster into our StreamNative cluster is 60 seconds. I may have switched it to 15. I can't remember, but I made sure that at least 60 seconds has passed here. So I'm going to go ahead and close the window for this consumer and start up a consumer that's pointing to my StreamNative BYOC cluster. We should see that it picks up at the correct location as long as I've used the same consumer group. So here, as you can see in the first consumer, I'm using consumer group called Kafka topic 2. And in this consumer group here, which is pointing to a different resources file or a client.properties file, it's also using the same consumer group. This one is configured to consume from that StreamNative BYOC cluster. You can see here that it picked up at 591. So that was the last acknowledgement that successfully made it from the consumer here, but you would make your application to have a graceful shutdown. Now that we've done that, I can go ahead and stop my producer. And here you can see the last message that got produced is 713. So I'd like to produce now directly to my StreamNative BYOC cluster. So I'm just going to tell it to start at message 714, and I'll just produce directly into that cluster as well. And I'll go ahead and run that new producer that's pointing to 714, and you'll see that the consumer is able to consume those messages as well. But instead of saying publish to legacy Kafka, they're going to say publish to StreamNative. So we've now moved over both the producers and the consumers. So actually the consumers first, then the producers, and correctly using the offset for the consumer group being migrated as well. So at this point, all of these messages, regardless of where they were published, either from or to the legacy cluster or to the StreamNative cluster, they'd all be visible inside of Snowflake through Snowflake Open Catalog as well.